Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Saturday morning. Yay! We all want to be here. Yay! Right?
Yes.
All right. So my name is Gregory, as the sign says. I want to talk about implementing Agile, some of the lessons learned from a testing perspective. Yesterday, at the lightning talks, Andreas, is that how you say the name? Did the 10 lessons learned, and I thought they were spot on. Andre. And they were spot on, they were really good. So today I'm going to choose, I've chosen 4 that I'm going to talk about. I've been doing Agile for about, I guess, 10 years, pretty close to 10 years. I'm from Calgary. How many people know where Calgary is? I can say Calgary. Yay! That's a whole lot more than if I go into the U.S. and ask the same question. Do not. That's what a mountain is about. We're about an hour out of Banff. And so we've got this nice drive and we've got mountains. And I was looking the other day and they're still snow covered completely. So it's kind of fun, but it's a little early to be going there for camping yet. I've been spending my time the last year and a half doing a lot of training, consulting, going into companies, helping them get their testers actively working on their Agile teams. I also wrote this really fat book. I co-authored it with Lisa Crispin. I'm going to give it away at the end of this talk. It's a secret how many. But I've been a tester, I've been a programmer, I've done a little bit of everything. I mostly work as a coach these days. And it's a lot of fun, but I do it from a testing perspective. So the things I hope you take away today is the very first thing I'm going to talk about, problems versus symptoms. Because a lot of times we solve the wrong thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to have 4 lessons that I've learned. And then I'm going to talk about the underlying problem behind it, how you recognize that. You might recognize it in your own company, in your own organization. And then hopefully there's some practical ideas and steps that you can go and try to address the issues. Agile to me is about practicing iterative, incremental development. The customer participation is I'm going to use the word customer, product owner, domain expert, whatever you choose to call it, or call that persons, they're critical to the success. And the whole team collaboration is really especially important from a testing perspective. And the testing each feature or each story as it's coded is what makes it special, because then I have that piece that I can say, we've got it, we can deliver it. It's delivered, and the business value is there. Sustainable pace is really important to me. As a tester from traditional environments, how many testers do we have here in the audience who would say they're testers? 1, 2 people. A few. I also hope that the developers consider themselves testers. Perfect. But when I'm talking about tester in this way, I'm talking about those people that have it as their role. Their title might be QA analyst, or QA person, or tester. I'm just going to use the word tester to define that role. In a traditional environment, what's always happened to me is that, I go along at this really quiet pace doing these tests, and then all of a sudden, it's a week before release day, and the developers finally give me the code, and then I'm working hours long, weekends, and everything else trying to get it done. And in Agile, I want to be doing a sustainable pace, which means I'm testing all the way through. I don't have that spike at the end where I have to be crazy, drive me crazy. And the feedback, that's what testers do. Testers give feedback to the developers, give feedback to the customers. And that's how we adjust our process. It's how we adjust how we do things. So it's really, really important. You know, and it really, it's common sense. How hard is it? Turns out to be pretty hard, actually. So this is the one slide I'm going to talk about problem versus symptom. Because too many times we go into our retrospectives and we list all of these things that we've done not so well. And we try to fix them. Most of the time, the things that we talk about in a retrospective are symptoms. So really think about the problem behind it. Ask why. Why did this happen? Yesterday, I think David said, don't ask why. But he was talking about customers and stories. You want to find out the what from them. But when you're doing a root cause analysis of your problem, ask the why. I walked into a team last year, and I was just doing a course, so I wasn't doing the retrospective. But one of the problems that came out was that their stand-ups were too long. And this had been going on for a couple of years, and they tried different things to solve it. And I said, well, what do you mean your stand-ups are too long? And they said, well, they're taking way more than the 15 minutes we're supposed to be doing, and they're not very effective. And I said, so what have you done about it? Well, turns out that the team size was 14. And so they determined that that was probably the problem, and they divided their team into two. You know, perfect team size, 7 plus or minus 2. But then they caused other issues, the communication problems that you have. So they tried that for a while, and they put their teams back together because the communication problems were more upsetting than the stand-ups. But they were still having that stand-up problem. People were bored, they weren't finding it, they were thinking of cutting it out altogether. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But they were solving the symptom. They were addressing the fact that they saw their stand-ups were too long. As we go through, I'm going to use that story. My very first lesson for testers, so go back, you developers, go back and tell your testers. Be involved. Early, often, all the way through. Testers have to be brave and have courage and say, I've got to be here. I'm going to be part of this team, whether you like it or not. It's important. The problem behind that is that feedback that is so important. If we're not involved all the way through, we end up testing too late. The feedback doesn't get to the people it needs to get to in time. We end up with this mini waterfall. So testing is either at the end of the iteration or, you know what, in the next iteration. We're not doing our job because we're not getting our feedback in a timely manner. We want to reduce that cycle time. So you can recognize if your team is having this problem. It's pretty easy, actually. So if you've got your storyboard and your testing tasks are all, sitting there, lining up, you know what? You're going to carry them to the next iteration. One of my favorites. How many people actually have done defined versus just done? Done? Come on. Yeah. It's a personal, I have a personal problem with that because it says to me that we don't have a very clear definition of done. Now, there is some kinds of testing that we can't do during an iteration. It might be an integration level test to test third parties or a whole lot of different types of browsers or operating systems. So what I try to do with that is I will take a task or I will create another story separately to deal with that rather than saying, this is done, but we have to do this other stuff later. Try to make them, cut it off. One of my favorite symptoms, because it happens just about in every team that I go to, is especially when teams are new. Our feedback is too late, So the bugs get to the developer. So I've got a bug and I go, can you fix this? No, I'm on the next story. So you write it up, you put it in the defect tracking system, and it sits there until you're hardening sprint or hardening iteration. I hate hardening iterations. I don't like them. So the only way to get rid of them is to fix the bugs when you can. If your feedback's too slow, you can't do that. Hardening sprints are there because you're not fixing them. The answer to this is a whole team approach. It's critical to testers. So being involved, being part of the team, absolutely critical. I've gone into teams where the testers go, yeah, we're not release planning. We're not even in iteration planning. How do they know what to test? How do they know what the story is? Sometimes they go, yeah, I'm in iteration planning. I go, do you participate? No. They don't know what their role is. It turns out that testers have a really important role. They get to ask a lot of questions. Simple ones like, how are we going to test that story? Or, this story, this report that we're changing, I think it actually affects something that we send to finance because testers seem to have a big picture view. They've been doing it for a while. They can tell you whether it's going to be a whole lot bigger from a testing perspective. The other good thing about the whole team approach is that anybody can pick up a task. So yesterday, when they were talking about Kanban, the work in progress, that doesn't have to be just for Kanban. It can be for any Agile method. Instead of, having 4 stories going, just say, you know what, we're only going to have 2 stories until at least one is done. That means anybody can pick up that testing task that is being left behind. It's a good way to get the whole team working together. The whole team taking accountability and responsibility for quality. In the Agile world, testers, QA folks, are not responsible for quality. It's the whole team, and it's a really important concept. So the power of 3 is another tool that I use. So domain expert, tester role, even if it's a developer on your team who's doing that role, somebody who's thinking with a testing mindset from a business perspective, and your developer. So anytime you talk about a story, make sure you have all 3 represented. Sometimes it's going to be the power of 4 because it's a really heavy UI story, and you're going to have your user experience person in. Or maybe it's documentation heavy and you've got this whole big thing of user manual and you need your tech writer. So what's your context? Really understand that. But use it. And testers need to add value. If they're not adding value, they're going to be ignored. So testers have to have that courage to get in there and say, I'm coming to that iteration planning meeting. I'm going to add value. Here's the value I can add. So they need to be involved all the way through. Any questions on this? This is the end of this first lesson. Any questions? Yes?
I'd like to point out that testers are fantastic to have involved during planning.
All right. Can you repeat that again?
Having testers involved in estimations is amazing because there's always a handful of issues, a handful of stories the team is looking at that looks really simple, but it's the tester who points out, but every time you see something like this, it has this risk and this risk and this risk that developers tend to take into consideration.
Perfect. I love that. Yes, David.
I I'd further comment that like testers, I think are some of the best editors that I've met. And so if you sit down and tell someone from testing your story, they start asking you all these questions, and helps you a lot when you go sit in front of a group of developers. You have a much better story to tell.
They like that a lot. Technical writers, by the way, make excellent testers. But probably the same kind of reason. Any other questions? Everybody agrees that testers need to be involved. Okay, how many don't have their testers involved? Perfect. Your testers involved. You're going to go back to your testers involved? Excellent. All right. The other thing that you can do, by the way, to get your testers involved, is practice your acceptance test-driven development. I put an open space up for talking about automated acceptance tests in open space. But practice, not just TDD, but ATDD. Did I say that right? Get your examples, get your tests from your customers. The testers can actually help your customers define those. Giving your tests early to the developers before they start coding. Even if it's just a piece of paper, it doesn't have to be automated. I like automated ones, but if you don't have the framework set up, if you've got a piece of paper saying, these are the variations that I'm going to be testing. I'm going to be testing for blanks and trailing spaces and everything else. All of a sudden, you know what? I'm not going to end up having a lot of failures and a lot of bugs that are a waste of my time, that should have been fixed right away. Because they're not going to give it to me. They're going to, the developers are going to code to pass those tests. At least the second time. First time, maybe not. Second time, yes. The other thing is breaking up stories. We talked about breaking up stories yesterday. It's not good enough to have them small. They've got to be testable. So the vertical slices. Remember the team I was talking about that had the long stand-ups? Turns out that the reason they were having the long stand-ups was because Joe had to explain what he was doing every time. Because he was working on the back end, the database stuff. And other guys who had a story that were talking about the GUI. Somebody else was doing the business logic. None of them tied together. So they had to explain each and every time what was behind it, or they felt they had to. Nobody cared about anybody else. As soon as they started talking, everybody else glazed over. So when they started changing their stories, so that they had small stories, but everybody was involved, all of a sudden everybody started thinking about, oh, what am I listening for? Well, you're doing that. Is that going to affect my story? Yeah. They went back down to 15 minutes because you didn't have to explain what was going on. Everybody was interested in what everybody else was doing because it affected them. The problem was not that the team was too big. The problem was not the stand-ups were too long. It was that the stories weren't testable and they weren't involving everybody. They couldn't be actually completed. It was kind of an interesting little thing. So really think about it. So when you're creating your teams and your stories, think feature teams instead of component teams. Don't divide them up into, he's the GUI guy and he's only doing the GUI stories and they're doing only the database stories. How are you going to get that vertical slice all the way through from GUI to database and all the way back up? How is it going to be testable? One of the best questions that testers can ask. How are we going to test that? So lesson number 2, it actually felt really good after I was in the open space yesterday. I was at the story mapping thing. From a tester's perspective, and this one actually goes into the developers as well. Learn the business domain. Understand what you're trying to develop. Turns out it's really important. I've worked with developers who I've said, because I'll go into a new team and I'll say, can you show me how this application works? And they'll say, can you go ask the tester? And I'll go, why? Well, I've never actually gone in through the GUI. I can't show you. I found that very disturbing because they've been doing the business logic and never actually learned how the domain worked. So what happens is the team actually guesses at implementation. Because they're thinking, I think I know what they want. They define their acceptance tests. Yeah, we can do this. It takes a long time to get it right. So that, you end up doing this back and forth thing all the time. So some of the symptoms that you're gonna notice this problem happen when you're getting bugs in your production environment. Customers are reporting them, and they're not software bugs. They're not a Stack Overflow or missing something else. They're requirements bugs. They're bugs with human error or data. Something other than software bugs. So if you're getting those, maybe you can actually have some issues that you can solve yourself by learning the domain. If you're spending a lot of time trying to understand what's going on, really ask yourself why. So something that you can do is challenge yourself. Go back and say, I'm going to learn what this report really means. I'm going to understand how that finance guy actually uses it. Because then, when you're in that iteration planning meeting, instead of just sitting there and giving all the responsibility to the customer, you're going to take some back and you're going to say, you're saying this is, the problem you're trying to solve. Maybe we could do it this way. Could that solve your problem? You might be able to recommend better ways of doing things. Don't put all of the accountability on the customer. Really take the time to understand what they need. What problem are they trying to solve? I worked with a team once that really took it to the letter that said, customer defines all the priorities. Well, it ended up that the customer didn't really understand what priority meant. And because the team wasn't giving back the risks involved, they were making really bad decisions about what to build next. There was a lot of rework because the team would say, yeah, the business guy keeps telling us what to do. And they ended up doing a lot of rework because they weren't taking the responsibility or accountability. They weren't learning the domain. Any questions on that? On the business domain? How many people really understand their business domain? Feel comfortable saying, I do? Yeah, that's good. How many, not so much? A few. Few brave people, yes. It's actually common. People don't take the time to learn. I'm really suggesting that you do. Question? Yes?
So with this then, would you have like the, maybe the testers sit down with the VAs, like the business analysts when they define requirements and help them do that? Because I've seen the same thing where it says saying Scrum, right? Product owner writes all the requirements. And so they're like, I don't have to do anything because they're writing all the user stories for us, acceptance criteria included, but they might not think of, they most likely won't think of this stuff kind of on the software side, like kind of the more nitty-gritty kind of acceptance criteria.
Yeah, so testers can, but I'm saying one step further. If you can, and it's not always possible, go out there and sit with the finance guy. The person who's actually using it, not just the VA.
Yeah.
Because there can be misunderstandings. You're still doing what they think that somebody else is doing. So really go and say, you know what, I'm going to go figure out what he does. The best training I've ever had going into a company was It was mandatory for every new hire, for every contractor coming in, that they spent a half a day in the help desk. So I had to sit with one of the support teams with a headset on and listen to customer complaints. The best training I ever had. Gave me a whole different view of what we were developing. The third lesson. I used to say, it's impossible. And now I added the almost impossible, because you know what? I've seen a team where they just kept adding testers to it, to do the manual regression testing. So I have to say almost now. If you're deploying 50 times a day, it is impossible without automated regression tests. If you're deploying every day, it's impossible without regression tests, without automated regression tests. So what happens is, the real underlying problem is, there's not a potentially shippable product if you're not doing your regression tests daily or at least every iteration. How can you know if it's ready? You can't. There is no safety net. Those regression tests need to be run. Lisa Chrisman, my co-author, says that when she went into one team she was at, they had these manual regression tests. And so she started to do it every iteration and found out that she couldn't do it, right? She was the only tester. So she took it, using that whole team approach, took it to the retrospective and said, we have a problem. How are we going to do this? The team decided that everybody would do the manual regression tests on the Thursday and Friday of the iteration end. Guess how long it took for them to automate those regression tests? They started the next iteration. Get developers to do manual regression tests, it sucks. You will start automating. Works really well. You'll know you have that problem because it's really simple. It's a simple problem, right? You want them running every day, at a minimum. If your testers are always spending their time retesting those bugs, and your bugs are creeping back in again because you don't have it. I mean, bugs shouldn't creep back in again if you've got things in a good, solid version control, but you know what? They have side effects. Automation only checks side effects. Won't find new bugs, but it will find those side effects. The other symptom is, ask your testers, are they doing any exploratory testing? That's what you want them to be spending their time on. You want them to be in the planning meetings, asking and preventing bugs right up in front. But when they're testing, you want their manual testing to be done exploratory, finding the things that you didn't think about. So there's a lot of ways around this. Agile's all about small chunks, tackling things, a piece at a time. So this pyramid, this Mike Cohn's, I think it was the first time I saw it anyhow, automation testing pyramid. It turns out that my regression tests, the very base of it, is the unit tests. As a tester, that's what I rely on, those automated unit tests. And when I say unit tests, I always mean automated. In my mind, there is no other type of unit test. If they're not automated, they're run once, and they do me no good. I need them as part of my regression suite. They're my base. I depend on those developer tests. So you start. Just take a small chunk. If I was going to invest in automated testing, and I had none, I would invest in the developer ones first. The next level, the acceptance tests at an API level, under the GUI, under the presentation layer. They're less brittle. There's so many tools out there now that let me collaborate with the developers. So tools like Fit, or Cucumber, or Robot. There's a ton of them out there that allow me to collaborate with the developers. Remember,
Are those business logic tests?
business logic tests, yes. So when I said before that I want to give my test to the developers, even if it's just on a piece of paper with variations, that's good. If I can have a test tool that allows me to give the automated test to the developer, how much better is that? When they're finished coding, I know that the tests are already run and passing. All the tests that I've thought of up front are passing already because they've run them. All I have to do now is my exploratory tests. That's how I keep up. So really use the pyramid to think about it. The top part of it are the GUI tests. You're going to need some automated GUI tests. But keep them to test the GUI. You know, I've done mine. I want to make sure that all the buttons hit the right page. But I'm not going to retest the functionality. I might have a few workflow tests, but I'm not going to have lots and lots of them because they're brittle. So really think about your tests and how you're planning them. You have a question?
Yes. How do you evaluate the quality of your automated testing framework? You can have a lot of tests, but how do you know you've got the right ones?
How do you know you got the right ones? Ask your testers. They're the experts. That was it. I'm sorry. Quality of automated tests. I trust. I heard trust yesterday a lot. I trust that the developers know what they're doing. They do peer reviews on their tests, on their code. As a tester, I won't write a test without a peer review either. I will take it. So when I take my tests to the developer, what I'm also going to ask is I'm going to say, so Rachel, I've got these tests that I'm going to do. Can you take a look at them? Do you got any feedback for me? I don't know the developers that will not give me feedback. They'll go, why are you testing this? This seems redundant. Or, you know, what about this? Because this has this impact. They're a good reviewer. I will take it to another tester if there's more than one of us in a team. I might take it to the customer and ask, but I'll have it reviewed as well. So that's, yeah. Quality, review. Same as developers. Any other questions? Everybody has, yes.
Hi. So we read the last statement with how do you know that your automatic tests are covering are good. I use a lot of card coverage tools. There are a bunch of card coverage tools that can outline if the source code do testers use that. I mean, I always ask my tester to see, do I have a coverage of 90%? Then it's good.
Okay.
At least 90%.
So code coverage is one mechanism, but it only tells me what the code is covered. It doesn't tell me if my tests are good. So that you need, it's only one measurement. So you use it, but don't use it as the only measurement. Same with unit tests. It's only one measurement. It tells you what has not been tested, but it doesn't tell you how good the tests are.
Shouldn't it be, I don't know, a minimum requirement?
It's interesting. Code coverage should be a minimum requirement. It's a huge conversation that I've had a lot of times. It's funny because when I say, what should the code coverage be? If I ask a tester and I ask a developer, guess which wants more? Guess who wants higher code coverage? The developers. I found that amazing the first time I heard it, but it's across the board. The testers have much more confidence in the tests they write. They're not putting the numbers on the code coverage. The developers care more about code coverage. Testers not so much.
That's mainly because it gives them confidence to explore and do crazy stuff.
Confidence to do crazy stuff. Exploratory testing is not crazy stuff.
The
But yes, the developers,
For
okay,
the developers, they need the confidence to do
yes.
a lot of
Well,
things.
so they're refactoring, right? So their code coverage, because they understand what code coverage means. And their unit tests, and code coverage for unit tests are really important because you're testing individual pieces. When you're doing a functional level test, you care more about the business logic, not about that every piece of code has been touched. And I think that's where the difference might come in between functional tests. When I say functional tests, I mean business tests. Okay, let's just go on to lesson number 4. I'm not very consistent with this, Mike. Complacency. I see it in teams that have been there and doing Agile for a while and start to get complacent. Or they panic. Testers tend to panic when somebody comes in and goes, oh, we got to release real fast. We tend to panic. And it's flip side of the same coin. Complacency or panic and stress. So if you see that old habits that you used to do are creeping back in again, really think about why, and because it happens. When we're panicking, that's the first thing we do. If our habits are not ingrained, we hear, oh, we don't have time, we gotta get it done. It's not a good thing. I heard somebody say, I forget who said it, don't have time to do the automated tests. Can you afford not to take the time? So really think about it. When you're bringing new people in, really watch. Are you training them into your habits? Or are you kind of saying, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, why are we doing it? Really think about that because new people coming in can have a negative effect sometimes. Your tests need to be reviewed and refactored. Exactly like code. And if you're not doing that, and if you're not having tasks, when you're defining your tasks, and you've got a nice suite of automated tests, you need to have estimates in there to say, we have to refactor our tests, or you end up with a lot of duplication, a lot of broken tests. Really think about what you're doing. Tests running green? Yeah, how can you forget that? It happens. I was in a team, I walked in, this was an Agile team who was deemed very successful. They've been doing it for 2 years. And I walked in and I was brought in to help train some of the domain experts in testing. They weren't having a good feeling that the domain was, that they were testing well enough. And I walked in and they had this really nice suite of automated tests. They developed a fit-like framework, and they were automating these tests all the time. But I come in and I start looking and I'm like, how come these aren't all passing? Well, one fails and then, we don't have time to fix it. So, and the next day another one fails. And I started watching this and I'm going, come on guys, gotta be fixing these. And they had been doing this for months and months. They were having internal releases. So at the end of every 3 months, they would go and they would fix all the automated regression tests, the functional ones. And this doesn't sound right. It doesn't, but when you're new coming in, you kind of watch the lay of the land. And then, so the next little release, mini release, I said, okay, we're not doing this. And I started posting the results. I'd been posting them before and nobody cared. And I said, we are not, I'm putting my foot down, we are not letting this get below 98%. Because it'll, you'll have a failing test every day. They couldn't run them every day. Every hour it took overnight to run them. So we started fixing the tests, and what we found was that it wasn't just the tests that were being broken. They were finding bugs in the code. But when you don't fix the test, if you don't fix the code and you get it running green, you miss that bug. And if you're leaving it to the end, those bugs aren't caught because you're busy changing the test and you don't know whether it's a test or a code that's broken. So you need to keep them running green. They need to be maintainable. If you're spending too much time maintaining them, look at your framework. Really think about it. So make that process visible. Put your metrics up on the wall. Show what's happening. And really examine your processes, your tests. Are they running green? They should be. The developers run theirs green all the time. Those functional tests you need to run green as well. That's why you need to make them less brittle and work at that API level under the GUI. The other thing that you can really do is make people understand the why behind the process. It's not good enough just to say, we're doing these tests, we're going to write them, we're going to review them, but not explaining why you need them to be running green all the time. If people don't have a vested interest, they don't get it. They need to understand the why. And use those retrospectives. The lightning talk that Rachel gave yesterday, really important. Bring up your problems. Testers are notorious at not bringing up their problems to the team. They try to solve it by themselves. They need to bring it up to the team to solve. That's the only way to get buy-in and to get quality responsible from the whole team. So you need to instill a learning mentality. I like to travel too, and this is from a trip to Africa. Animals know how to be a team. They know the synergy is natural in them. They learn from each other. They work together. You know, one's got really good eyesight, one's got good hearing, one's got good smell. They work together. We can learn from each other on a team as well. So really, really think about it. So I'm just going to kind of finish up here. Got 5 minutes left. We'll have some questions. But really consider the whole team participation. Success factor number 1 from testers when we ask the question. Testers can't do it on their own, and if they're kind of separate, and you've got this separate test team, they're using us versus them language. Bring them in. Make them part of the team. Make them accountable. The collaboration is a really big part of that. Using the tools, using face-to-face conversation. If you distribute it, really think about what you're using. Automate those regression tests. Period. All levels. And just be involved and understand why you're doing things to prevent that complacency. And when you see people start to panic and forget to do stuff, stop. Really think about it. That's the book. There's a bunch of resources. There's lots of things out there about testing these days. 10 years ago, not so much. But there's lots of blogs. The Testing Yahoo group is actually a really good group to belong to. You can ask a lot of questions. People respond. So I'll finish up. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Before we do the questions, though, because I'll forget otherwise, I'm going to give away a copy of the book. We were going to do it a different way, but we forgot to think about it yesterday. I wrote a number down. So between 1 and 100, that's the easiest way I can think of. So everybody kind of just, I'll trust that you don't change your number. Think of a number between 1 and 100. Everybody got their number? Nobody's going to cheat? Trust, right? I put it on the back of here, and somebody took the sticker off. Trust. The number I wrote down was number 15. Anybody guess 15? What's the closest to 15? 11, 17, 17 is closest. Anybody closer than 17? Okay. Okay, thank you. So any questions? Yes.
So, if you're starting on a greenfield project, all this is fine with that. But what do you do with a, I don't know, like in my case, 8-year-old legacy project? How do you start with that?
Agile, small chunks. So one team that I worked on, we had a legacy app. The quality sucked, and we were given this, we had to fix it or else. So what happened was the developers chose to say, every time we touch a piece of the legacy code, so you add a new feature on and you have to touch this, we don't touch it until we put unit tests in and we refactor it. So within the course of just a little over a year, they had unit tests for the whole legacy app. And they did do a couple of stories to say, this is really bad. This is a bad chunk, we need to refactor this. And so they did do some very specific ones, but just approaching it one chunk at a time, they were able to do that. While they were doing that, we did put in some, from a functional level, at a very high level, we took and implemented some Ruby with water to test through the UI, to do some very basic business level testing that had to work all the time. And then we started approaching the other testing below the UI and setting up the framework. And we just did it. It took us a year, a little over a year, but we did it. So small chunks, don't tackle anything huge, just one step at a time.
I've been thinking about the evolution of the integration of the team between development and testing. And I think I've definitely identified the first two phases. The first one is where the testers think the developers are idiots and the developers think that the testers are their enemies. And I think a lot of people have seen that. The second one, I think, is one that's really easy to be complacent in, and that's where they work together and the developers tend to think of the testers as the people who make them look good to the public, who help clean things up and make sure that everything looks good by the time it gets out. But I want to hear what you think about the third phase. I suspect that the third phase, if one really continues to refine this process, looks something like testers and developers working together to consistently and constantly improve and validate their process. But I've never seen it happen. What do you think is once you've got testers and developers working well together in their respective roles, that second phase, what does improvement look like? What's the goal to further improvement look like?
I think, and that's really interesting because that's kind of a philosophical discussion. I sit there like to spend an hour with you. What happens is when you've got those two roles, and it is a natural progression, is that those roles become non-existent. In a really mature team, you'll find that we're just all developers. Today, I might be, my role, my main role might be testing, but I'm just part of the team, and it's just how you work together. So there won't be testers, there won't be or programmers, they'll just be developers. Everybody will be doing it. I just have this role today, and somebody has to play that. I don't say somebody has to, because I have seen teams that have no quote tester role on it, but you have to have a hat on, and you have to understand your context. If you've got a large application or product, the developers aren't going to know it all. They're down deep in the weeds thinking about code, so you're going to want to have somebody who has that overview. And so I think, and it's kind of, I'm thinking on the fly here, it'll depend on what your application is and your product team, what that next phase will look like. I really think it might depend on that a lot. Not a good answer. David.
You mentioned water, so for people that don't know about it, water, watt-in, and wattage, I think don't get enough press.
They don't. So come to the automated acceptance test, the open space, and we'll talk about tools if necessary. Yeah.
The other question, maybe for the open space, is you said something. I always tell people if I had to go into outer space with one kind of test, it would be automated acceptance tests. And you said kind of the opposite. And I felt that way because I've gone into for years and years to places where there were thousands of unit tests and still really poor products.
Yeah. So if I was going to, yeah, I said get those development tests working because they're the highest return on investment. Because those developers start getting feedback immediately. Usually at the same time, I will start with the automated acceptance tests and work, top down, bottom up. But yes, if you don't have those unit tests, you're messed up no matter how much automated acceptance tests you have. Who doesn't agree with me? That's okay. I like to put the accountability back in the developer's hands. That's what I want to do. My time's up. So I'll turn it back over to who's ever running this show.